There is a morning you will never see. It exists now only as sediment, compressed layers of ash and soil, and the faint chemical traces of things that burned. A hearth, some worked stone, the impression, preserved in hardened ground, of a floor where bodies slept and rose and moved through the ordinary demands of staying alive. The people who made that morning are gone in every sense that the living can comprehend. Their faces cannot be recovered. Their names, if names is even the right word for what they called each other, are gone, but they were real. That is not a small thing to say. It is easy. When the evidence is fragmentary and the distance is measured in tens of thousands of years, to let the people dissolve into abstraction, into data, into a set of skeletal measurements and tool types and pigment samples that get discussed in journal articles, without anyone stopping to note that behind every data point there was a life, a specific, unrepeatable life, lived by a creature who woke up cold and tried to get warm and cared whether the people around them lived or died. They cared. The bones tell us that much. At multiple sites across Europe and Western Asia, researchers have found the skeletal remains of Neanderthals who survived injuries that should have killed them. Broken bones healed over months, degenerative conditions that would have left individuals unable to feed themselves, survived for years. This does not happen by accident. It happens because someone decided, repeatedly and over extended time, to keep a person alive who could not keep themselves alive. That is not instinct. Instinct does not maintain itself through a winter. They buried their dead. Not always. And the interpretation of some sites remains contested. But the pattern across enough locations is real enough to take seriously. Bodies placed in the ground with what the evidence suggests was intention. Whether there was ceremony, whether there was grief in any sense the word can carry, we cannot say. The bones do not speak to that. But the behavior is documented. They put ochre on their bodies and on the objects they made. They wore ornaments that served no practical function. They selected eagle talons and perforated shells and arranged them in ways that suggest a concept of appearance, of identity, of what it meant to be seen by others as a particular kind of being, by almost any measure available to us. These were not simple creatures. And yet, there is something we cannot find in their record, not because we have decided it was absent, because what we are looking for does not leave stone or bone or residue that survives in the earth. It leaves something else entirely. It leaves the record of what a group knew, building on itself. Year after year, generation after generation. Each group passing forward more than it received, until the accumulated weight of everything anyone had ever figured out became something that no single mind could contain, but that all minds could draw upon. That record exists in our lineage, in theirs. No clear evidence of it has been found at anywhere near the same scale. Why? That is the question this story will follow. Not to deliver a verdict on a species that cannot speak in its own defense, but to trace the shape of something so fundamental to what we are, that we have almost entirely stopped noticing it. Something so woven into every moment of your life that it takes a very specific kind of effort to see it at all. You are using it right now. Chapter 1. The question nobody could answer. In the year 1866, the most prestigious linguistic society in the world did something that has almost no parallel in the history of organized scholarship. It banned a question, not a researcher, not a paper, not a methodology. The question itself, the Linguistic Society of Paris, which at the time represented the most concentrated collection of serious language scholars in Europe. amended its bylaws to formally prohibit any discussion of the origin of language from its meetings and its publications. The ban was not a temporary measure. It was written as policy, enforced consistently, and remained effectively in place for the better part of a century. This was not ignorance. The people who passed that ban knew exactly what they were doing. They had watched, for years, what happened when serious scholars attempted to address the question seriously. The discussions went nowhere. Every theory, proposed with confidence, was countered with equal confidence by an opposing theory. And neither side had any mechanism for resolving the disagreement, because neither side had any real evidence. The origin of language was the kind of question that made otherwise careful thinkers reach for speculation and dress it as conclusion. The society decided it was better to say nothing than to perform the appearance of progress while achieving none. The theories they were banning deserve a moment, because the names given to them tell you something important about how the scholars of that era felt about the state of the field. The Bow Wow theory held that language began when early humans started imitating the sounds of the natural world. Animals, thunder, water moving over stone. Words, on this account, grew out of acoustic mimicry. It sounds reasonable for approximately the length of time it takes to try to explain the word justice through animal sounds, at which point it stops sounding reasonable entirely. The yo-he-ho theory held that language grew out of the rhythmic vocalizations of communal labor. Groups hauling heavy things, lifting in coordination, grunting together through physical effort. Plausible as far as it goes. It goes almost nowhere. The poo-poo theory held that language originated in emotional exclamations, the sounds that escape a body in surprise or pain or sudden pleasure. Again, this explains how some sounds might have become conventionalized. It explains almost nothing about grammar, or abstraction, or the capacity to describe things that are not present and have never been witnessed. Researchers gave these theories those names themselves. The condescension was deliberate. It was the field's way of acknowledging, in the only register available at the time, that the serious answers they had produced were indistinguishable from the unserious ones, that everyone was, in some fundamental sense, guessing. The problem was not intelligence. The problem was evidence. Language does not fossilize. This is a fact so simple that it is easy to move past without letting it land properly. A femur from 50,000 years ago survives in the right soil conditions. A stone tool survives for millions of years under the right circumstances. The chemical signatures of fire and pigment and organic material can persist through geological time given enough luck and the right burial conditions. But the sounds a creature made disappear the moment they are made. The meanings attached to those sounds exist nowhere in the physical world except in the minds of the creatures who share them. The rules by which sounds are combined into meaning, and meaning into something larger than meaning. The vast invisible architecture of a language leaves no direct trace in the archaeological record. None. There is no stratum you can dig to and find grammar preserved in it. There is no bone that tells you what the creature who owned it was capable of saying. What this means for researchers is that every claim about when language appeared, or where, or in what form, or in which species, must be built entirely from inference, from the shape of a skull that might tell you something about the brain it housed, from the organization of a site that might tell you something about the social complexity of the people who lived there, from the tools people made and the distances those tools traveled and the networks that movement implies. Inference is not nothing. Inference, done carefully and honestly, is how science operates in domains where direct observation is impossible. But inference has limits, and the limit in this domain is reached very quickly. Because the thing being inferred, a capacity for symbolic communication, is precisely the kind of thing that does not leave the kind of evidence that closes arguments. This is why Paris banned the question. Not because it was unimportant, because in 1866, there was no way to answer it that was meaningfully better than guessing, and the field had grown exhausted by the spectacle of distinguished people guessing at high volume. What changed was not a single discovery. Science rarely moves by single discoveries, despite the stories told about it. What changed was the slow accumulation of tools that did not exist in 1866, tools that made it possible to approach the question from angles that the scholars of that era could not have imagined. Genetics entered the picture in the latter half of the 20th century and transformed it. The ability to read the history of populations in the sequences of living DNA, and eventually in the DNA extracted from ancient bone, opened questions that no amount of morphological analysis could reach. It became possible to ask not just what creatures looked like, but how they were related. When populations diverged, what genes they carried, and what those genes did. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome in 2010 was a moment that changed what it was possible to say about our closest extinct relatives. Not because it answered the question of language, but because it showed that the question was considerably more complicated than anyone had assumed. Neuroscience offered its own transformation, the ability to watch language happening in a living brain, through imaging technologies that did not exist a generation ago, and to map in precise detail what breaks down when language breaks down, produced a picture of the neural architecture underlying speech that is richer and stranger than anything the 19th century could have conceived. The brain is not a uniform medium through which thought flows. It is a structured organ with specific regions serving specific functions, connected by specific pathways. And the history of how that structure was assembled is a history that can now be partially read from the fossil record of the skulls that housed it. Comparative cognition spent decades doing something that sounds simple and turned out to be extraordinarily revealing, systematically testing what other animals can and cannot do. What a chimpanzee can learn about symbols and what it cannot. What a songbird can do with acoustic sequences and what it cannot. What a dolphin can do with referential communication and what remains beyond it. The results of this work have complicated almost every simple story about what makes human language unique, and in the process have made the actual uniqueness clearer and more interesting than the simple stories were. And paleoanthropology, the study of the physical remains of our ancestors and near relatives, has produced in the last several decades a record of human and near-human behavior that is more detailed and more surprising than anything available to the scholars of Paris in 1866. The picture that has emerged is not the picture anyone expected. It is not a picture of a single gene that flipped a switch. It is not a picture of a single anatomical change that unlocked a capability that had been waiting to emerge. It is not a picture of a single moment in a single population where something entirely new entered the world and everything after was different. It is a picture of a threshold, a point in the history of one lineage where a set of conditions, each with its own long evolutionary history, each arrived at through its own sequence of pressures and adaptations, converged in sufficient degree at the same time to make possible something that none of them could have made possible alone. Understanding that threshold means understanding each of the conditions that composed it. And the place to begin is not in the brain, and not in the social world, though both of those will matter enormously before this story is finished. The place to begin is more fundamental than either. It begins with the body, with the specific and strange and costly physical changes that made certain kinds of sound possible in the first place, and with the question of why a lineage would pay those costs, and what the payment tells us about what was being purchased. The body changed first. The question is how, and why, and what the changes were actually buying. Chapter 2. The body that had to change. You are going to choke sometime in your life. Not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech. At some point, food or liquid is going to enter your airway when it should not. And your body is going to respond with the full urgency that a blocked airway deserves. Your diaphragm will convulse. Your throat will constrict. Every system available to the task of clearing that passage will activate simultaneously and with considerable force. Most of the time, it will work. Sometimes, in the very young or the very old or the simply unlucky, it does not. And when it does not, the result is death by a mechanism so basic, so undignified, so entirely preventable in any reasonably designed system, that it seems almost impossible that natural selection would have allowed it to persist. But it did allow it. It allowed it because it was paying for something else. The human larynx sits lower in the throat than the larynx of any other primate. In a chimpanzee, the larynx is positioned high, close to the base of the skull, in an arrangement that keeps the airway and the food passage almost entirely separate. Air goes one way, food goes another. The two paths barely intersect. And the result is that chimpanzees almost never choke. The geometry of their throat makes choking difficult. In humans, the descended larynx creates a shared chamber at the back of the throat, a space where the path of air and the path of food converge before diverging. Every time you swallow, a precise and rapid sequence of muscular actions is required to close the airway and direct food toward the esophagus rather than the trachea. Most of the time, this works. The system is well designed within the constraints it operates under, but the constraints are real, and the failure mode is fatal. And no other primate lives with that failure mode built into every meal. Evolution preserved this arrangement, which means the arrangement was doing something valuable enough to justify the cost. The acoustic argument goes like this. A lower larynx creates a longer vocal tract. The resonating tube of space between the vocal cords and the lips through which air passes before leaving the body as sound. A longer vocal tract can produce a wider range of sounds, particularly a wider and more distinct range of vowel sounds, than a shorter one. The geometry of sound production is such that the length and shape of the resonating space above the vocal cords determines which frequencies are amplified and which are dampened, and a longer space with more capacity for reshaping produces more acoustic variety. More acoustic variety means more distinct sounds. More distinct sounds means more capacity for a communication system built on the reliable discrimination of those sounds by listeners. This is a real advantage. It is documented. It is not in dispute. But here is what must be said clearly, because this is where popular accounts of speech evolution most often go wrong. The descended larynx is one change. It is one trade-off in one part of one system, and it is not sufficient by itself to explain anything about language. A parrot has a vocal apparatus that looks nothing like a human throat and can produce sounds that rival human speech in acoustic complexity. Certain species of gibbon produce elaborate vocalizations of considerable variety without anything resembling the human arrangement. The relationship between a particular anatomical configuration and the capacity for complex vocal communication is not a simple one-to-one correspondence. Anatomy opens possibilities. It does not determine what is done with them. The reconstruction of Neanderthal vocal tracts. which has been attempted from fossil evidence with considerable ingenuity and considerable caution, remains genuinely contested. Some analyses suggest Neanderthals could have produced a range of sounds overlapping substantially with modern human speech. Others are more reserved. The honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know with the precision that would be needed to draw firm conclusions. The soft tissue that determines vocal output in the most critical ways does not survive in the fossil record. What survives is bone, and bone tells you only so much. So the larynx is part of the picture, an important part, but not the frame. Consider breathing, because breathing is where the picture becomes stranger and more interesting. Most mammals breathe automatically. The control of respiration in most species is handled by brainstem processes that operate below conscious awareness, running continuously and without deliberate input from the creature doing the breathing. You are breathing right now without thinking about it. You have been breathing throughout this entire account without once deciding to take a breath. The system runs itself, but you can override it. You can hold your breath. You can breathe faster or slower on command. You can sustain a precisely controlled exhalation for the duration of a long sentence, modulating the airflow continuously as the sounds you are making require. You can do this for hours. You can do it while thinking about something else entirely. And when the sentence is finished, your respiratory system returns to automatic without requiring any conscious decision to let it do so. This capacity for voluntary respiratory control, for the ability to consciously manage airflow over extended and precisely shaped exhalations, is not universal among primates. Chimpanzees have substantially less voluntary control over their breathing than humans do. The neural pathways that allow deliberate override of the automatic respiratory system are considerably less developed in our closest living relatives. This matters in a way that is easy to underestimate. Producing speech is not producing a series of discrete vocal sounds. It is managing a continuous stream of precisely shaped air over intervals of time that vary from a fraction of a second to many seconds. Shaping that stream in real time in response to the demands of meaning, modulating pressure and duration and rhythm across the full length of an utterance. This requires a level of respiratory control that, outside of humans and a small number of other species with specialized vocal abilities, does not exist in the animal kingdom. The tongue deserves more attention than it usually receives in these accounts. The human tongue is, relative to its size, one of the most complex muscular structures in the body. It contains no bones. It is composed almost entirely of interlocking muscle fibers arranged in 3 dimensions, capable of changing shape in an extraordinary range of ways, moving between configurations in fractions of a second, sustaining precisely controlled positions for durations that speech requires. The number of distinguishable positions the human tongue can occupy within the vocal tract, and the speed at which it can move between them, has no close parallel in any other primate. The neural investment in tongue control reflects this. The region of the motor cortex devoted to controlling the tongue in humans is vastly disproportionate to the tongue's size relative to the rest of the body. The brain has allocated an extraordinary amount of its computational resources to the precise management of this one structure. That allocation is not an accident. It is the biological record of an extremely long history of selection pressure, favoring finer and finer control over the sounds a mouth can make. And then there is the hyoid. The hyoid bone is a small, U-shaped structure in the throat, positioned above the larynx, that serves as the anchor point for the muscles of the tongue and the floor of the mouth. It is anatomically unusual in that it does not articulate with any other bone in the body. It floats in the throat, suspended entirely by muscle, moving as the muscles that attach to it move. In 1989, researchers excavating at the site of Kebara Cave in Israel recovered a Neanderthal hyoid from remains dating to approximately 60,000 years ago. It was the first hyoid ever recovered from a Neanderthal individual, and its discovery prompted immediate and intense discussion, because the bone was, in its overall morphology, very similar to the hyoid of modern humans. The question of what that similarity means has not been fully resolved. The shape of the hyoid is related to the arrangement of the muscles attached to it, which is related to the configuration of the vocal apparatus more broadly, which is related to the range of sounds that can be produced. These relationships are real, but each step in the chain of inference introduces uncertainty. And the chain from hyoid morphology to conclusions about speech capacity is longer than it sometimes appears in accounts written for general audiences. What the Kebara hyoid tells us, stated as carefully as the evidence allows, is that Neanderthals were not anatomically simple, that the structures associated with complex vocalization were present in recognizable form, that the skeletal architecture of their vocal apparatus was not obviously incompatible with the kinds of sounds that human speech requires. What it does not tell us is whether those structures were being used in ways that produced anything like what we mean when we say language, because language is not an anatomical property. It is not a feature of bone or cartilage or muscle. It is a property of what a nervous system does with those structures. And the nervous system, in all its critical detail, does not preserve in the fossil record, which is why anatomy, as revealing as it is, can only take this story so far. The body is where the capacity for speech begins. The configurations of the throat and the tongue and the respiratory system open the acoustic space within which complex vocalization becomes possible. They are prerequisites. They are necessary conditions. But in the history of science, a necessary condition has never been sufficient to explain anything complex. Necessary conditions are places to start. They are not places to stop. To understand how the prerequisites became a language, you have to go somewhere that no fossil can take you directly. You have to go into the brain. Not the brain as a general organ of cognition, not the brain as simply a large computing system that produces smart behavior. The brain as a specific, structured, historically assembled architecture, with particular regions connected by particular pathways, shaped by pressures that we are only beginning to understand, into something that no other structure in the known universe can do. That is where the story goes next, and it begins, as many of the most important stories in neuroscience begin, with a man who could say only one thing. Chapter 3. The Brain That Rewired Itself. His name was Louis Victor Laborgne. He had been a patient at the Bicêtre Hospital outside Paris for 21 years when Paul Broca admitted him to the surgical ward in the spring of 1861. He was 51 years old. He had been institutionalized originally for epilepsy, and over the course of his time at Bicêtre had developed, gradually and then completely, a deficit so strange and so total that the staff had given him a nickname. They called him Tan. It was the only sound he could make, not the only sound in any mechanical sense. His vocal apparatus was intact. His throat and tongue and lips functioned normally. He could modulate volume and pitch and emotional expression. He could produce, when frustrated, combinations of syllables that carried obvious feeling. But in terms of language, in terms of the deliberate production of words that meant things, he had been reduced to a single syllable. Whatever question was asked of him, whatever situation arose, whatever he needed or wanted to communicate, The output was the same. Tan, sometimes tan, always and only that. What made Libornia's case medically remarkable and historically significant in ways that were not fully appreciated until much later was the other side of the deficit. He understood everything. Instructions of arbitrary complexity he could follow. Conversations happening around him he clearly tracked. His comprehension of the world and of language was, by every assessment available to Broca's era, entirely intact. The deficit was purely in production. The machinery for understanding language was running. The machinery for producing it had gone silent. Broca examined him on the 11th of April, 1861. Liborn died 5 days later. Broca performed the autopsy himself and found in the left frontal lobe of the brain a lesion, a region of softened and damaged tissue, localized to an area that had not previously been associated with anything so specific as the production of speech. That area now bears Broca's name. The discovery did not immediately transform neuroscience. Science rarely works that way, but it opened a question that has not closed since, and that has grown more interesting and more complicated with every decade of investigation that has followed. It opened the possibility that language, the capacity that felt most immaterial about human beings, most like pure mind, floating free of physical substrate, had an address, that it could be mapped, that the brain was not a homogeneous medium through which thought moved uniformly, but a structured organ with specific regions dedicated to specific functions, and that some of those functions were, in ways that would take generations to understand, distinctly human. Karl Wernicke, working in Germany a decade after Broca, identified a different region, damage Wernicke's area, in the posterior part of the left temporal lobe, and the deficit is the mirror image of Libornia's. The patient can speak fluently. Even grammatically formed sentences emerge without apparent effort. But the sentences mean nothing. Words are produced without connection to their reference. Content that should be there is absent. The river of speech flows without anything in it. Two regions, two dissociable functions, a production system and a comprehension system, close enough to interact constantly, distinct enough to fail independently. This was the beginning of a map. The map has been refined enormously in the century and a half since Broca looked at Libornia's brain in a room that smelled of carbolic acid and mortality. What imaging technology has revealed in living brains, and what careful lesion studies have revealed in brains that have been damaged in specific ways, is a picture of language as a distributed network rather than a pair of isolated modules. Language involves the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe and the connections between them. It involves regions associated with motor planning and regions associated with auditory processing and regions associated with semantic memory and regions whose precise contributions are still being worked out. The map is not 2 points. It is a web, but within that web, the connections matter as much as the nodes. The arcuate fasciculus is a bundle of nerve fibers running through the white matter of the brain, arching from the temporal lobe to the frontal lobe, carrying information between the regions associated with language comprehension and the regions associated with language production. In humans, this pathway is large, heavily myelinated, extensively branched, and connected to a wide range of cortical regions on both ends. It is not a simple wire. It is a highway system, with multiple lanes running in multiple directions, capable of carrying the real-time coordination of meaning and sound that fluent speech requires. In chimpanzees, a corresponding pathway exists. This is important to state clearly, because older accounts sometimes describe the arcuate fasciculus as absent in non-human primates. And that description was not accurate. The pathway is there, but it is considerably less developed than in humans, less extensive, connected to fewer regions at each end. The bandwidth, to use an imperfect but useful metaphor, is substantially lower. What this suggests, and what the broader pattern of evidence from comparative neuroanatomy supports, is that the neural architecture underlying language was not assembled suddenly. It was not switched on in our lineage at a single point. The components from which it was built existed in earlier and less elaborated forms in species that predate us, and were progressively enhanced, progressively connected, progressively reorganized into something that could do things the earlier versions could not. This is a pattern that will appear repeatedly in this story. Not a binary, not a before and after, a gradient, with a threshold somewhere along it, past which qualitatively new things become possible. Now, consider a family. In the 1990s, researchers studying a three-generation British family, referred to in the scientific literature as the KE family, identified a pattern of language difficulty that ran through approximately half its members. The affected individuals shared a cluster of deficits. They had difficulty with the fine motor control required for articulating speech sounds. They had difficulty with certain aspects of grammatical processing. They performed below the unaffected family members on a range of language-related tasks. They were not globally cognitively impaired, but their relationship to language was significantly and consistently compromised in ways that tracked through the family across generations. The cause turned out to be a mutation in a single gene. The gene was eventually identified and named FOXP2. Its discovery generated headlines in popular science publications that described it as the language gene, the gene that makes us human, the genetic switch that separates our communication from everything else in the animal kingdom. These descriptions were not accurate, and the ways in which they were not accurate matter for understanding what FOXP2 actually is. FOXP2 is a transcription factor. It is a gene that regulates the activity of many other genes, involved in the development of neural circuits related to motor learning, to the precise sequencing and coordination of complex movements, to the kinds of fine motor control that skilled actions of all kinds require. It is expressed in the lungs and the heart and the gut. It is found in crocodiles and fish and songbirds. It is not specific to language. It is not specific to humans. It is not specific to speech. What is specific to humans is a version of the protein it produces that differs from the chimpanzee version at 2 amino acid positions. Those 2 positions appear to have been under strong positive selection in our lineage within the last several 100,000 years, meaning that the human variant spread rapidly through ancestral human populations in a way that suggests it was providing a significant advantage in the context of what FOXP2 does broadly. The most plausible interpretation of that advantage involves the fine motor control and motor learning capacities that precise speech production requires. When researchers inserted the human variant of FOXP2 into mice, replacing the normal mouse version with the human one, the mice produced ultrasonic vocalizations that were measurably different in structure from those of control mice. Not language, not words, not anything that a listener would recognize as communication, but acoustically different in ways that the researchers could quantify, in ways that suggested the gene was doing something real to the neural circuitry underlying vocalization. FOXP2 is a piece of the system, a real piece, with a documented role, with a specifically human variant, with experimental evidence connecting it to the neural machinery of vocal control. But a piece is not a system, and the mistake of treating it as the answer, rather than as one component of a vastly more complex architecture, is the mistake that led to headlines that the evidence did not support. Here is where the story requires a pause. In 2010, the same year that the Neanderthal genome was sequenced for the first time, researchers examining that genome found FOXP2, the human variant, the same version whose absence in the KE family caused the deficits that led to its discovery in the first place. Neanderthals carried it. Sit with that for a moment. Every piece of anatomy that seemed relevant. The hyoid bone, the inferred vocal tract dimensions, the brain size, all of it was already complicated. But FOXP2 had seemed like a candidate for the clean story, for the single factor that would explain the difference. And the genome said no. The genome said that Neanderthals had the same variant of the gene that humans carry, the same variant that is necessary for normal language development, the same variant that when absent produces the KE family's deficits. This did not mean Neanderthals had language in the full sense that humans do. It meant that the story was not going to be resolved by any single factor. It meant that whatever the difference was, it was not FOXP2 alone. It was not the larynx alone. It was not the hyoid alone. It was not brain size alone. It was something that required all of those things, and more, at the same time, in the same lineage, to a sufficient degree, which raises the question that the neuroscience, by itself, cannot answer. The brain is the instrument, but instruments do not explain why they are played. They do not explain the pressures that shape them, or the contexts in which their capacities became necessary, or the reasons why one lineage built an instrument of this kind and others, facing the same world, built different ones. To understand that, you have to step back from the anatomy. You have to step back from the genome. You have to look at the social world that our ancestors were living in and ask what problems they were trying to solve, and why solving those problems in the specific way that language allows would have been worth the extraordinary biological investment that language required. You have to watch, for a moment, what chimpanzees do with their hands, and understand why hands were never going to be enough. Chapter 4. Why words became indispensable. Watch a group of chimpanzees for long enough, and you will notice something that is easy to misread. They touch each other constantly, not in the way that animals touch each other when they are mating or fighting or competing for food. This is different. Two chimpanzees will sit together for long periods, sometimes for hours, one working slowly and methodically through the fur of the other, fingers moving with a patience and attention that has no obvious utilitarian explanation. The animal being groomed sits still, often with its eyes half closed, in a posture that looks, from a sufficient distance, remarkably like relaxation, like comfort, like the specific quality of ease that comes from being in the presence of someone who means you no harm. It looks like affection. It is affection, in some sense, that the word can carry across species lines. But it is also something else. Grooming in primates is the primary currency of social relationship. It is how alliances are built and signaled and maintained. A chimpanzee that grooms another chimpanzee is making a social investment, creating a bond of reciprocal obligation that will matter when food is scarce, or a threat appears, or a coalition needs to be assembled quickly. The time spent in grooming is time spent constructing the social architecture that makes a group functional rather than merely proximate. It is, in the most fundamental sense, political behavior. It is the management of relationships through physical contact. In a small group, this system works with considerable efficiency. A troop of 30 or 40 chimpanzees can maintain its social fabric through grooming. There are enough hours in a day. and enough physical proximity between individuals who sleep and forage and move together for the necessary bonds to be tended and renewed through touch. The system is slow and it is labor-intensive, requiring up to 20% of the active hours of a day in some populations. But it functions. The social structure holds. The problem is that it cannot scale. You can groom one animal at a time. That is the physical constraint that no social motivation can overcome. While your hands are occupied with one relationship, every other relationship is going unattended. In a group of 30, this is manageable. In a group of 100, the arithmetic of available hours and the number of bonds requiring maintenance begins to fail. In a group of 200, it fails completely. The time required to maintain all the necessary relationships through physical contact exceeds the time available. And the social structure that depends on those relationships starts to come apart. Robin Dunbar is a British anthropologist who has spent several decades working on a question that sounds, stated simply, almost too simple to have taken decades. The question is, why do primates have such large brains? The answer that intuition suggests, that big brains are for solving complex problems in the physical environment, for making better tools, or navigating more efficiently, or processing food in more sophisticated ways, turns out not to fit the evidence particularly well. Primates do not show especially strong correlations between the complexity of their physical environment and the size of their neocortex. What they do show, with a consistency that has held up across a large number of species and a large number of studies, is a correlation between neocortex size and social group size. The bigger the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, the larger the stable social group the species typically lives in. Dunbar's interpretation of this pattern is that the neocortex in primates is primarily a social organ, that the computational demands driving its expansion were not the demands of navigating a complex physical world, but the demands of navigating a complex social one, keeping track of who is allied with whom, remembering who did what to whom last week and the week before, predicting how a specific individual will behave in a specific situation based on everything you know about their history and their relationships, calculating the social consequences of your own actions before you take them. These are not simple computations. They scale in complexity faster than the size of the group, because the number of possible relationships between individuals grows exponentially as the group grows. A group of 10 individuals contains 45 possible pairwise relationships. A group of 50 contains 1,225. A group of 150 contains more than 11,000. Tracking all of that, even approximately, requires a great deal of cognitive machinery for chimpanzees, whose neocortex size predicts stable groups of around 50 individuals. The grooming system and the cognitive load of social tracking are in rough balance. The system works at cost, within the range it was shaped for humans, whose neocortex predicts stable groups of around 150. The grooming system cannot work, not because humans lost the motivation for physical contact, which they clearly did not, but because the mathematics of time and touch cannot support the number of relationships that a group of 150 requires. Something had to replace it, something that could do what grooming does: maintain bonds and signal alliance and manage reputation and transmit social information. But that could do it faster, at greater range, and to more than one individual at a time. Dunbar's proposal was language, not language as a tool for describing the physical world, or for coordinating the logistics of a hunt, or for transmitting technical knowledge about tool-making, though language does all of those things. Language as social grooming at scale. The ability to maintain a relationship with someone who is not physically present. Through the exchange of information about shared acquaintances, the ability to signal alliance and create obligation without touch. The ability to manage your reputation in the eyes of people you cannot see, by managing the information that flows through the network about what you have done and what you have said, and whether you can be trusted. Across cultures and across contexts, researchers who have systematically studied the content of human conversation have found a pattern that is remarkably consistent. Somewhere between 60 and 65% of what people talk about in conversation after conversation, in culture after culture, is other people. Who did what? Who said what about whom? Who behaved well in a situation that required it, and who did not? Who can be relied upon and who cannot? Who broke a norm that the group depends on, and what the response was? This is often called gossip, and the word carries a weight of condescension that the behavior does not deserve. What that 65% represents is not idle chatter. It is the continuous real-time maintenance of a social map of extraordinary complexity. A map that every individual in a large group needs to navigate their social world effectively, knowing who is trustworthy and who is not, who is powerful and who is declining, who is allied with whom and on what terms, is not peripheral to survival in a large human social group. It is central to it. And language is the only system that can transmit that information at the speed and the volume and the range that a group of 150 requires. This is Dunbar's framework. It is an important hypothesis, grounded in substantial comparative data, with genuine explanatory power. It is not a closed case. Researchers debate the specific mechanisms, debate the directionality of the relationship between language and social complexity, debate whether the correlation between neocortex size and group size is as clean as the original formulation suggested. The picture is more complicated than any single explanatory frame can hold, but the core observation is difficult to dismiss. Once richer vocal communication became possible, in a species already living in large and socially demanding groups, the advantage it provided would have been immediate and compounding. The individual who could maintain more relationships more efficiently was better positioned socially. Better positioned socially meant better access to resources, to coalition support, to the kind of distributed intelligence that a large group represents. The pressure to elaborate communication. Once communication had crossed some initial threshold of usefulness, would have been relentless. Language, once possible, would have become indispensable very quickly. But here is the question that Dunbar's framework, for all its power, does not fully answer. Because Neanderthals also lived in groups. They also maintained social bonds. They also cooperated in ways that required coordination. The social pressures that drove the elaboration of communication in our lineage were not absent from their world. They faced a version of the same problem that our ancestors faced. Why did the path diverge? Why did one lineage build something that accumulated and traveled and grew more complex with each generation it passed through, while another lineage, sharing so much of the same biology and facing so many of the same pressures, did not produce a record that shows the same pattern? That question cannot be answered by grooming, or by social group size, or by the architecture of social cognition alone. It requires looking directly at Neanderthals, not as a supporting character in our story, not as a failed version of what we became, but as the central evidence for what the threshold actually was, and how high it actually stood. Because the most important thing about the Neanderthal story is not the ways they were different from us. It is the ways they were not. It is how close they were, how much they had, how little. When you examine the inventory honestly, seems to have been missing. and how much that makes the question harder, and more important, and more genuinely unresolved than any simple account of their disappearance has ever acknowledged. That is where this story goes next, into the record they left, into what it contains and what it does not, into the gap between what they had and what they built with it, and into what that gap, whatever it was, wherever it lived in their biology and their culture and the space between them, actually tells us about the threshold we crossed, and they did not. Chapter 5. The Mirror Species. On a July morning in 2010, a paper appeared in the journal Science that changed the terms of the conversation permanently. The paper reported the first successful sequencing of the Neanderthal nuclear genome. The technical achievement behind it was considerable. Ancient DNA degrades. It fragments into short pieces that become chemically modified over time in ways that complicate sequencing. It is contaminated, overwhelmingly, by the DNA of microorganisms that colonize the bone after death, and by the DNA of the modern humans who handled the samples. Separating genuine Neanderthal sequence from everything else required years of methodological development that did not exist when the project began. The result was a draft genome assembled from bone fragments recovered from Vindija Cave in Croatia, covering enough of the Neanderthal sequence to answer questions that had previously been unanswerable. One of the first things the researchers looked for was FOXP2. They found it. The human variant, the same two amino acid positions that distinguish the human version of the protein from the chimpanzee version, the same positions that had been under strong positive selection in the human lineage, the same positions whose alteration in the KE family produced the language deficits that led to the gene's discovery in the first place. Neanderthals carried the human variant of FOXP2. The reaction in the research community was not simple. For those who had hoped that FOXP2 would be the clean answer, the single genomic difference that explained why humans had language and Neanderthals did not. The finding was a complication for those who had suspected that the story was more layered than any single factor could capture. It was a confirmation of the layering. For everyone, it was a signal that the question was going to require more from the evidence than the evidence had previously been asked to give. What it was not, despite some popular accounts that briefly suggested otherwise, was evidence that Neanderthals had language in the full sense. Having the gene that is necessary for normal language development is not the same as having the neural architecture that gene helps build in its most elaborated form. Having a component of a system is not the same as having the system. The genome told researchers something important. It did not tell them everything, and what it left unresolved is, in some ways, more interesting than what it resolved. Let us be precise about what Neanderthals had, not what we assume they had, and not what we assume they lacked. What the evidence, read as carefully and as honestly as it can be read, actually supports. They had large brains. This is not a minor point, and it is not a qualifier offered to soften a harsher judgment. The average endocranial volume of Neanderthals was slightly larger than the average for anatomically modern humans. Their brains were not smaller. They were differently shaped, more elongated and less globular than ours. A difference whose cognitive implications are still being worked out, and which should not be casually interpreted as indicating inferiority. But in raw, volumetric terms, the Neanderthal brain was not outmatched by ours. They had the human variant of FOXP2. They had a hyoid bone, recovered at Kibara Cave in Israel and dating to approximately 60,000 years ago. That is in its overall morphology, very similar to the human hyoid. The implications of this for vocal capacity are real but bounded. As discussed earlier, the chain of inference from bone shape to conclusions about speech, is long and involves uncertainties at each step. The hyoid is evidence of anatomical similarity. It is not evidence of linguistic equivalence. They cared for their injured and their elderly over periods of time that required sustained intentional support. At the site of Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found the remains of a Neanderthal individual who had suffered and survived injuries of considerable severity. One arm had been amputated or lost above the elbow at some point well before death. One eye socket showed evidence of a blow that likely caused blindness. Degenerative joint disease had significantly limited mobility. This individual survived for years in a condition that would have made independent subsistence impossible. Someone, and not just one, someone over one difficult period, but a sustained social network over an extended time, kept this person alive. That is a social fact of considerable weight. They used ochre, the iron oxide pigment that researchers associate with symbolic behavior in early Homo sapiens sites across Africa, was also used by Neanderthals. The interpretation of what that use means is debated. Some researchers argue for symbolic function. Others suggest more utilitarian possibilities, such as use as an adhesive component or a hide preservative. The debate is genuine and has not been resolved. But the behavior is documented across multiple sites and cannot be dismissed. They made ornaments. Perforated shells and eagle talons showing evidence of having been worn have been found at Neanderthal sites in Spain and Croatia. These are objects that served no mechanical function. They were carried and worn and, the evidence suggests, displayed. The symbolic interpretation of this behavior is contested in its details, but supported by the pattern. They buried their dead. The evidence for intentional burial at Neanderthal sites is debated more actively than it was a generation ago, with some researchers arguing that what was initially interpreted as deliberate burial may have other explanations in some cases. But across enough sites, with enough associated features, the pattern of intentional placement of bodies is real enough to take seriously as a documented behavior. This is the inventory of what they had. Read it again, slowly, because it matters. Large brains, the human variant of FOXP2, hyoid anatomy, similar to ours. Social bonds strong enough to sustain injured individuals through years of dependency. Symbolic behavior in the form of pigment use and ornamentation. Possible mortuary practice. By the standards that a generation ago were considered the markers of fully modern human behavior, Neanderthals pass a significant portion of the checklist. Now look at what the record does not clearly show. There is no clear evidence of sustained, cumulative cultural elaboration at the scale documented in Homo sapiens. The Mousterian stone tool tradition, associated primarily with Neanderthals over a span of hundreds of thousands of years, shows a degree of regional variation and occasional innovation that researchers continue to debate, but the pattern of change over time does not show the progressive acceleration. The building of new techniques on the foundation of previous ones. The elaboration of form and function across generations in ways that produce traditions recognizably connected across centuries. That characterizes the archaeological record of anatomically modern humans in the same period and after. This distinction requires care, because it is easy to overstate it. Neanderthal technology was not static. Neanderthals were not incapable of innovation. The Mousterian toolkit included tools of considerable sophistication, and there is evidence of adaptation to local conditions and materials across different Neanderthal populations. The point is not that nothing changed. The point is that the rate and pattern of change, the way innovation built on innovation, does not show the same signature that appears in the modern human record. There is no clear evidence of long-distance exchange networks operating at the scale documented in the African Middle Stone Age sites associated with Homo sapiens. Materials from specific geological sources appear at Homo sapiens sites, hundreds of kilometers from those sources, in quantities, and with a regularity that implies sustained relationships between groups that could not have maintained those relationships through direct physical contact alone. The Neanderthal record does not show this pattern clearly. Materials move, but generally over shorter distances and without the same signature of sustained, organized, long-range exchange. There is no clear evidence of the kind of cumulative artistic elaboration that appears in the Homo sapiens record. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, and dozens of other sites, represent traditions in which techniques and conventions and subjects developed over time, in which later artists were working within frameworks established by earlier ones, in which something was being transmitted and built upon across generations. Whether Neanderthals produced art of any kind remains genuinely debated. Some researchers interpret certain markings and arrangements at Neanderthal sites as symbolic. Others are more skeptical. The honest position is that the evidence does not resolve the question cleanly, and that the most responsible thing to say is that whatever symbolic behavior Neanderthals engaged in, the record does not show it developing and elaborating over time in the way the Homo sapiens record does. Why? This is the question that every piece of Neanderthal evidence raises, and none of them fully answers. And the honest position, the position that the current state of the research actually supports, is that we do not know with certainty. We have frameworks, we have hypotheses that fit more or less well with different parts of the evidence. We do not have a closed case. What we have is a pattern. The pattern is this: Neanderthals had, in recognizable and sometimes nearly equivalent form, many of the individual components that seem to be necessary for language and for the cumulative cultural transmission that language enables. They had the anatomy. They had the gene. They had the social complexity. They had behaviors that look, from a sufficient distance, like the behaviors of creatures with rich inner lives and sophisticated social worlds. And yet the thing that language ultimately makes possible, the accumulation of knowledge across generations at a scale and speed that allows each generation to begin further along than the previous one, does not appear in their record with the clarity and the consistency that it appears in ours. The difference was not one thing. It was not FOXP2. It was not the hyoid. It was not brain size. It was not social complexity. It was something that required all of those things, and something more, operating together in sufficient degree. At the same time, it was a threshold. And the most important question this story has raised is the one it now has enough pieces to answer. Not what any single component of the threshold was, but what the threshold looked like when all the components are considered at once, what it meant that they all had to converge, and why the convergence, when it finally happened, changed everything that came after it in ways that no single piece of the architecture could have produced alone. That is what the next chapter is about. It is about the threshold itself, and about what it actually means that we are on the other side of it. Chapter 6. The Threshold. Start with a thought experiment. Take every capacity that fully elaborated human language requires. Not language as an abstraction, not language as a philosophical concept, but language as it actually functions in the world. The specific, operational thing that allows a human being to say something that has never been said before and be understood. That allows information to travel from a mind that holds it to a mind that needs it, across distances and across time, with enough fidelity that what arrives resembles what departed. That allows a child born into a community to absorb, within a few years and without formal instruction, a system of such complexity that the most sophisticated computational models built by the most capable engineers alive today cannot fully replicate the acquisition process. Take that thing, in all its operational specificity, and ask for each of its prerequisites, how many species have this? Watch what happens to the list. The first condition is fine motor control of the vocal apparatus, not the ability to make sounds, which is widespread in the animal kingdom, but the ability to produce precisely controlled sequences of sounds rapidly, with enough consistency that a listener can reliably decode them in real time. Speech is not a series of isolated events. It is a continuous stream of muscular adjustments, dozens of muscles coordinating across fractions of a second, producing transitions between sounds that carry as much information as the sounds themselves. The neural investment required to control that process with the necessary precision outside of humans and a small number of other species with highly specialized vocal abilities simply does not exist. Most of the animal kingdom is eliminated at the first condition. The second condition is voluntary respiratory control sustained over extended utterances. This has been discussed, but its elimination power deserves emphasis. A sentence is not a grunt. It is a shaped exhalation that may last 3 seconds or 10 seconds or longer, modulated continuously in pressure and duration and rhythm, adjusted in real time as the demands of meaning shift. Producing that requires the ability to consciously override the automatic respiratory system and maintain that override for the duration of the utterance. Then release it. Then override it again for the next utterance. Thousands of times a day, without fatigue or error. This capacity, in the degree that speech requires it, is not present in our closest living relatives. Most of what survived, the first condition, is eliminated here. The third condition is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Vocal learning. Most animals are born with the vocalizations they will ever make. A chimpanzee raised in complete isolation from other chimpanzees will produce, when it vocalizes, the same calls that chimpanzees raised in normal social environments produce. The sounds are specified in the genome. They cannot be modified by listening. They cannot be added to by experience. A chimpanzee cannot hear a new sound and reproduce it. It cannot adopt the vocalizations of a neighboring group. It cannot, in any documented sense, learn to say something it was not already genetically prepared to say. This is not a limitation that applies universally. Vocal learning, the capacity to hear new sounds and reproduce them, to modify vocalizations based on acoustic input from the environment, appears in songbirds, in certain whales and dolphins, in bats, in elephants, in seals, and in humans. In each case, the neural circuitry underlying it appears to have evolved independently of the others. It is not one ancient capacity that was retained in some lineages and lost in others. It is a convergent solution, arrived at separately by lineages with entirely different evolutionary histories, to the problem of flexible acoustic communication. The independence of these evolutionary origins is significant. It means that vocal learning is not easy. It is not the kind of capacity that emerges as a byproduct of general intelligence or general neural complexity. It requires specific neural architecture dedicated to linking auditory input to motor output in ways that allow heard sounds to be reproduced. Building that architecture from scratch, which is what convergent evolution implies, happened multiple times in multiple lineages, requires substantial biological investment. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, cannot do it. Gorillas cannot do it. The great apes, as a group, do not show vocal learning in any robust, documented form, which means that somewhere in the evolutionary history of the human lineage, after the split from the lineage that produced chimpanzees and bonobos, the capacity for vocal learning was built. The neural circuits that connect hearing a sound to reproducing a sound were assembled, refined, and connected to the broader cognitive systems that give learned vocalizations their meaning. After this third condition, the list is considerably shorter. Most of what survived the first two conditions is gone. What remains is a small set of lineages, widely separated on the tree of life, that have independently solved the problem of learning new sounds. None of them, with one exception, has gone further. The fourth condition is theory of mind at sufficient depth, some version of theory of mind, the capacity to model the mental states of others, to understand that another individual can have beliefs, desires, and knowledge that differ from your own, appears to be present in a range of species. Chimpanzees understand something about what others can and cannot see. They adjust their behavior based on inferences about what other individuals know. Certain corvids, ravens and jays, show evidence of understanding something about the perspective of others in ways that influence their caching behavior. The capacity to model other minds is not uniquely human in its most basic form, but the depth to which humans take it has no documented equivalent elsewhere. Human communication is built on a layered structure of mental state attribution that operates automatically and continuously. When you speak to someone, you are not merely producing sounds. You are constructing an utterance calibrated to what you believe that specific listener knows and does not know. What you believe, they believe about what you know. What you intend them to understand. What you intend them to understand. That you intend. This recursive modeling of minds within minds within minds. The tracking of multiple layers of belief and intention simultaneously in real time is the cognitive substrate on which the full elaboration of language rests. Without it, you can signal, you can indicate, you can produce vocalizations that cause responses in others, but you cannot have a conversation in the sense that humans have conversations. Because conversation requires that both parties are continuously modeling each other's mental states and adjusting their communication accordingly. The depth of that modeling in humans and the automaticity with which it operates is not clearly matched in any other species. The fifth condition requires the most careful handling, intentional communication. The deliberate production of signals with the goal of changing the knowledge state of a specific audience exists in many species and in many forms. What distinguishes human language is not intentionality as such. It is the combinatorial openness with which human communication deploys intentional signals. The ability to take a finite set of elements, sounds, words, grammatical structures, and combine them according to a generative system that produces an essentially unlimited range of distinct meanings. The ability to say things that have never been said before and to understand things that have never been heard before. The ability to describe things that do not exist, events that have not occurred, possibilities that may never be realized, counterfactuals, hypotheticals, fictions. This recursive, open-ended, combinatorially explosive quality of human language is not a matter of degree in the way that most of the other conditions are. Matters of degree, no communication system documented in any other species approaches it. The alarm calls of vervet monkeys are referential but fixed. The songs of humpback whales are complex and culturally transmitted, but operate within constraints that human language does not. The signed systems that great apes have been taught in laboratory settings are impressive demonstrations of cognitive flexibility, but remain, in their combinatorial range and their generative power, far below the threshold that even a 3-year-old human child has crossed. This combinatorial openness is not a property that can be added to a communication system as an afterthought. It requires a specific kind of grammar, a generative system of rules for combining elements that can apply to its own output, producing structures of arbitrary complexity from a finite set of parts. Building and learning and using such a system requires cognitive capacities in working memory and in the ability to track hierarchical structure across time that are themselves not universal. The sixth condition is the one that everything else depends on, and the one most frequently underestimated: cumulative cultural evolution. Individual learning changes the individual who learns. Social learning, learning by observing and copying others, allows information to spread through a population within a generation. But what makes human culture unlike anything else documented in the natural world is neither of these. It is the ratchet effect. The capacity of each generation to receive what previous generations learned, preserve it with fidelity, add to it, and transmit the accumulated total forward, so that knowledge compounds over time rather than resetting with each generation. A chimpanzee that discovers a new technique for accessing food can transmit it to others through observation. If the technique is useful, it may spread through the group and persist across generations. This is real cultural transmission. It happens, but it happens without the ratchet. If the individual who discovered the technique dies before transmitting it, or if the transmission is imperfect, the knowledge is lost. There is no external storage. There is no redundant transmission through multiple channels. There is no way for an individual who was not present to access what was discovered. Because access requires direct observation of a living practitioner, language is what the ratchet runs on. The ability to represent a discovery symbolically, to encode it in words that can be spoken to someone who was not present, written down, repeated, transmitted across distances that the speaker and the listener will never both occupy, stored in a form that survives the death of everyone who participated in the original discovery, is what allows knowledge to accumulate rather than oscillate. It is what allows a scientist today to build on the work of someone who died 300 years ago, in a country the scientist has never visited, in a language the scientist had to learn specifically to read their work. It is what allows any human institution of any kind to persist beyond the lifetimes of the individuals who founded it. Each of these 6 conditions has a representative evolutionary history. Each emerged on its own timeline, under its own selective pressures, through its own sequence of incremental modifications to existing biological machinery. None of them was built for language. The respiratory control was built for something. The fine motor circuitry was built for something. The social cognition was built for something. The capacity for vocal learning was built for something. Each was shaped by pressures that had nothing directly to do with syntax or semantics or the transmission of symbolic information across generations, but in one lineage, at one period in the history of life on this planet. They converged, not simultaneously, in a single generation, not through a single mutation that switched everything on at once, through a process of incremental accumulation. Each step building on previous ones, each capacity enabling or amplifying others, over a span of time that dwarfs the entirety of recorded human history, until there came a point, not identifiable as a specific date or a specific place or a specific individual, at which the convergence was sufficient, at which all the conditions were present in sufficient degree at the same time in the same lineage, at which the threshold was crossed. Now, consider what that crossing actually means. It means that every individual capacity in the list above is, on its own, insufficient. Fine motor control without vocal learning produces precise sounds that cannot be modified by experience. Vocal learning without theory of mind produces flexible sounds that are not calibrated to the knowledge state of the listener. Theory of mind without combinatorial grammar produces sophisticated social cognition that cannot generate novel propositions. Combinatorial grammar without cumulative cultural transmission produces an expressive system that resets with each generation, accumulating nothing. The threshold is not any one of these conditions. The threshold is the point at which all of them are simultaneously present in sufficient degree that they begin to amplify each other rather than merely coexist, at which the whole becomes, in a completely non-metaphorical sense, greater than the sum of its parts. This is why Neanderthals are so important to the story. Not because they help us feel better about the difference between us and them, not because their nearness to the threshold makes our crossing of it more dramatic, but because they are the best available evidence for what it looks like to have many of the components without crossing. They had anatomy that was compatible with complex vocalization. They had the gene that is necessary for the fine motor control of speech. They had social bonds of sufficient depth to sustain vulnerable individuals. They had behaviors that suggest inner lives of real complexity. And the record they left does not show the cumulative elaboration that language enables, which suggests that what they may have lacked was not any single component, but the full convergence. That some of the conditions were present and some were not. Or that all of them were present, but not all in sufficient degree. Or that the connections between them, the ways in which each amplifies the others, had not fully assembled. The honest answer is that we do not know precisely what the gap was. We know there was a gap. We know it was not bridged in their lineage. We know it was bridged in ours. And we know what bridging it produced. Not immediately, not all at once, but in the period following the crossing of the threshold. The human record begins to look different in a way that has no precedent in the history of life on this planet. Not just more complex tools, not just larger social groups. A qualitative change in what groups could know, and preserve, and build upon, and transmit to people they would never meet. That change is the subject of the next chapter, not as a catalogue of human achievements, not as a celebration of everything that language made possible, but as a precise accounting of what actually changed when cumulative cultural transmission became possible, and what it means that we are the only lineage in the known history of life that has experienced it. That accounting matters, because it is the only way to understand what was actually at stake at the threshold, and what was lost when it was approached but not crossed. Chapter 7. What the threshold built. Think about this morning, not the extraordinary parts. There were probably no extraordinary parts. That is the point. You woke up. You moved through the first hour of your day doing things so familiar that you did not have to think about most of them. You may have checked something on a screen. You may have spoken to someone, or read something, or listened to something that someone else had made. You consume, in the first hour of consciousness, more information than most organisms process in a lifetime. None of it felt remarkable. That is the most important fact about language and everything it has built. It has become so thoroughly woven into every moment of human experience that the experience of living without it is essentially unimaginable to anyone who has it. You cannot step outside it to see it clearly. You are inside it the way a fish is inside water, with no meaningful experience of what the alternative would feel like. no frame of reference for what the world would be without the medium you move through. What this chapter is going to do is try to make it visible, not by celebrating it, but by tracing precisely what changed when the threshold was crossed, and what those changes actually mean for the kind of creature that crossed it, and everything that creature subsequently built. Start with knowledge, and what happens to it over time. A chimpanzee that figures out a more efficient way to crack a particular kind of nut has acquired something valuable. If the chimpanzee is observed by others, and if those others are sufficiently motivated to imitate, the technique may spread through the group. Studies of wild chimpanzee populations have documented exactly this kind of cultural transmission. Behaviors spread. Techniques persist across generations. What one individual discovers can become, through observation and imitation, the practice of a community. But watch what happens at the edges of the system. If the individual who first developed the technique dies before being observed, the technique dies with them. If the transmission is imperfect, if the observer captures something close to, but not exactly the original behavior, the information degrades. If the group is disrupted, if the individuals who carry the knowledge are dispersed or killed, the knowledge can vanish entirely, leaving no trace in the group that reconstitutes afterward. There is no storage outside of living practitioners. There is no way to access the knowledge except by being in the physical presence of someone who has it and watching them use it. The knowledge exists only in bodies. When the bodies are gone, the knowledge is gone. Now, consider what language changes about this. A human who develops a technique, or makes an observation, or arrives at an understanding of how something works, can speak. That act of speaking, that conversion of internal knowledge into external symbol, is the most consequential transformation in the history of information on this planet. It takes something that existed only inside one nervous system and puts it outside, into the air between two people, temporarily, into marks on a surface. If the conditions exist for writing, more permanently, into the memory of a listener who was not present when the discovery was made, but who now carries it and can transmit it further. The knowledge is no longer trapped in the body that generated it. It can travel. It can be received by individuals who will never meet the individual who produced it. It can survive the death of every person who was present at its origin. It can be combined with other knowledge, generated in other places at other times, by people who had no contact with each other, to produce understandings that none of the original contributors could have reached alone. This is the ratchet. And the ratchet does not just preserve knowledge, it transforms the relationship between knowledge and time. Without the ratchet, knowledge in a population oscillates. It rises when conditions favor learning and falls when disruption occurs. It can reach sophisticated levels within a single generation of talented individuals, and then decline when those individuals die and the transmission fails. There is a ceiling imposed by the limits of what one generation can discover and transmit through direct observation. And that ceiling is encountered repeatedly, because there is no mechanism for building beyond it. With the ratchet, knowledge in a population can compound. Each generation begins not at the baseline of what can be discovered in a single lifetime, but at the accumulated total of what all previous generations have discovered and preserved and transmitted. The ceiling is not fixed. It rises with each generation that adds to the accumulated store, and the rate of rise can itself accelerate, because more accumulated knowledge means more tools for generating new knowledge, which means more new knowledge to accumulate. Consider what this looks like over time. 40,000 years ago, a human group in Western Europe knew how to make fire, how to work stone into tools, how to track animals across terrain, how to read weather, how to prepare food for preservation, how to navigate by stars, how to maintain the social bonds that keep a group functional through winter. Each of these bodies of knowledge was itself the accumulated product of generations of discovery and refinement, transmitted forward through exactly the mechanism being described here. 10,000 years ago, some human groups had added to this the knowledge of how to cultivate plants, how to manage animal populations, how to store food across seasons, how to build permanent structures, how to organize communities larger than a single foraging band. These were not individual discoveries. They were the products of cumulative refinement across generations, each generation building on what the previous one had worked out. Each improvement preserved and transmitted forward, so that the next generation could improve on the improvement rather than starting over. 5,000 years ago, some human groups had developed writing, which extended the ratchet beyond the limits of memory and the reach of direct transmission. Knowledge that had previously been constrained by what a human mind could hold and a human voice could convey could now be stored in a form that survived indefinitely, accessed by individuals who would be born centuries later, combined with other stored knowledge in ways that the original authors could not have anticipated. This is not a story about the inevitable march of progress. There have been collapses. There have been periods in which accumulated knowledge was lost, traditions broken, libraries burned, communities dispersed. The ratchet can slip. It has slipped. The point is not that loss is impossible, but that the mechanism for recovery exists in a way that it does not for species without cumulative cultural transmission. When knowledge is lost in a human community, the knowledge still exists somewhere else, in other communities, in other texts, in other minds. It can be retrieved. It can be relearned. The baseline from which recovery begins is not zero. For a species without language, when the knowledge is gone, it is gone completely. The recovery must begin from scratch, through the same slow process of individual discovery and imperfect transmission that built the knowledge in the first place. Now, take this mechanism and follow it into the specific structures of human civilization. Because the ratchet is not just an interesting property of how knowledge behaves. It is the foundation on which every large human institution rests. And the institutions themselves are worth examining precisely because of what they reveal about what language actually built. Consider law. A legal system is, at its most fundamental level, a set of shared beliefs about the meaning of certain words and the consequences that follow from them. It exists entirely in language, not in the sense that it is written down, though most of it is, in the sense that without the capacity to represent rules symbolically, to transmit those rules to individuals who were not present when they were formulated, to apply them consistently across situations that the original formulators did not anticipate, and to argue about their meaning in ways that refine and extend them. A legal system cannot exist in any form that resembles what the word means. The rules that govern your life today were built across centuries of argument and precedent and deliberate revision by people who are long dead. In circumstances that have no direct connection to your own, you are governed by the accumulated decisions of people you will never know, transmitted forward through exactly the mechanism that language makes possible, refined and extended by each generation that encountered them and found them insufficient for the situations it faced. This is not governance by tradition in the loose sense. It is governance by accumulated symbolic representation, transmitted through a system that only language can provide, applied to situations that the original formulators could not have imagined by individuals who have never met them. Strip out language and you do not get a simpler legal system. You get no legal system. You get norms, enforced through direct social pressure within a group small enough for direct observation. You get the kind of social order that chimpanzees maintain, which is real and sophisticated in its own terms, and absolutely bounded by the size of the group and the range of direct interaction. Consider science. A scientific tradition is a method of inquiry transmitted across generations, combined with the accumulated findings of every researcher who has applied that method since its formulation, stored in a form accessible to researchers who will apply it to questions that have not yet been asked. The physicist working today on problems that did not exist as problems 50 years ago is doing so with mathematical tools developed centuries ago by people working on entirely different problems, in entirely different intellectual contexts, whose work was preserved and transmitted and eventually recognized as applicable to new situations. Science is not what happens in a laboratory. It is what happens in a laboratory combined with everything that has ever happened in every other laboratory, transmitted forward through the mechanism of symbolic representation and cumulative storage. Remove the transmission, and you remove the cumulation. Remove the cumulation, and what remains is individual observation, which is valuable and real and not nothing, but which cannot build on itself across generations, and therefore cannot produce anything that resembles what science has produced. Consider what you know about your own body, the knowledge of how the cardiovascular system works, how pathogens cause disease, how the immune system responds to infection, how surgical intervention can address structural failures, was built across centuries of observation and experiment by thousands of individuals in dozens of countries speaking dozens of languages, none of whom could have produced alone more than a fraction of what the accumulated tradition has produced together. The physician who treats you draws on knowledge that no individual human mind has ever contained in its entirety, that exists only in the distributed system of preserved and transmitted symbolic representation that language makes possible. This is the thing that crossed the threshold, not any individual human capacity, not any single discovery or invention or institution. The mechanism itself, the ability to convert knowledge into symbols, transmit the symbols across any distance and across time, receive and decode the symbols and add to them, and transmit the augmented total forward. The ability to make knowledge cumulative rather than oscillating, compounding rather than resetting, available to individuals who were not present at its generation and who may never meet anyone who was. Now look one final time at Neanderthals, not to close the question of what they had and what they lacked. The question is not closed and may never be fully closed, given the nature of the evidence available, but to ask what the threshold model suggests about what the difference was. If cumulative cultural transmission is what language ultimately enables, at its most consequential level, then the question about Neanderthals is not whether they communicated. They clearly communicated. The question is whether what they communicated could accumulate in the way that human knowledge accumulates. Whether the information that passed between individuals in a Neanderthal community could compound across generations, build on itself, survive disruption and be recovered, travel to groups that had no direct contact with the group that generated it. The archaeological record does not show this pattern clearly in their lineage. The tools do not show the same signature of progressive, cumulative elaboration. The exchange networks do not show the same reach and organization. Whatever was transmitted between generations in Neanderthal communities, the record of what it built does not look like the record of what cumulative transmission builds. This is not a judgment about their intelligence. Intelligence is not what is at issue. A Neanderthal individual, placed in a modern human community from infancy, might well have developed language and participated fully in everything that language enables. The question is not about the capacity of individual Neanderthal minds. It is about whether the system for transmitting what those minds knew was capable of the kind of cumulative elaboration that the human system achieved. The evidence suggests the answer is that it was not, or that it was not, to the same degree, in the same way, at the same scale. And the distance between those two outcomes, between a system that transmits and a system that transmits cumulatively, is the distance between every morning that has ever been lived and the morning you woke up to today. It is the distance between the stone and the screen you are looking at, between the fire and the city, between everything a single lifetime can discover and everything that every lifetime has ever discovered, preserved and compounded and made available to you without your having done anything to earn it, except to have been born into a lineage that crossed the threshold. That is not a small distance. That is everything. Go back to that morning. The fire, the worked stone, the child being tended with a patience and a care that required choosing, repeatedly and over time, to give what the child needed rather than what the adult needed to keep for themselves. 40,000 years ago, in a coal that asked everything of a body and everything of a mind just to get through a single season. We know more about those people now than we did when we began. We know what they had. The anatomy that was compatible with complex vocalization, the gene that is necessary for the fine motor control of speech, the brain that was large enough, by any simple volumetric measure, to support sophisticated cognition, the social bonds that were deep enough to sustain individuals through years of dependency, the behaviors that point, across the distance of 40,000 years, toward inner lives of real complexity and real feeling. We know what the record shows and what it does not show clearly. We know where the evidence ends and where the inference begins. And we have tried throughout this account to be honest about the distance between them. That honesty matters. It matters because the Neanderthal story is not a story about a species that was simple or limited or undeserving of the world it inhabited. It is a story about a species that was, by almost any measure available to us, extraordinary. And the question of why their path did not lead where ours led is not a question with a clean answer. And anyone who tells you otherwise is getting ahead of the evidence. What the evidence does support, carefully and honestly read, is the threshold model. The idea that what separated our lineage from theirs was not any single component of the architecture, not the larynx alone, not the gene alone, not the brain size alone, not the social complexity alone, but the full convergence of all the necessary conditions, in sufficient degree, at the same time, in the same lineage, such that each condition began to amplify the others, rather than simply coexist with them. The convergence produced something. It produced the ratchet, the capacity to convert what is known into symbols, transmit the symbols across any distance and across time, receive them and add to them, and transmit the augmented total forward. The capacity to make knowledge compound rather than oscillate, to make each generation the inheritor of everything. All previous generations learned rather than the reinventor of it. And the ratchet produced everything else. Sit with that for a moment. Not as an abstraction, as a weight that you can actually feel if you let it land. Every piece of knowledge you carry that you did not generate yourself, which is nearly all of it, came to you through the mechanism that the threshold made possible. The language you think in was not invented by you. The concepts you use to organize your experience of the world were developed by people you will never know, in circumstances you cannot fully imagine, across centuries of refinement that you benefited from without contributing to. the institutions that structure your daily life, the medical knowledge that has kept you and people you love alive through things that would have been unsurvivable in any previous era. The accumulated understanding of the physical world that produced every technology you use without thinking about it. All of it arrived at your door through a mechanism of transmission that only exists because one lineage crossed a threshold that no other lineage has crossed in the same way. You did not earn any of it. You inherited it. Every human being alive today inherited it. Equally and without condition. Simply by being born into the lineage that crossed. Think about what it means to inherit something from people you will never meet. The physician in Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, who noticed that a particular plant reduced fever, and told someone, and that someone told someone else. And the knowledge traveled forward through chains of transmission, whose individual links are entirely lost to history, until it arrived eventually at the pharmacological tradition that produced the medication sitting in your cabinet right now. That physician did not know you existed, could not have imagined you, had no way to intend that their observation would reach you across 40 centuries and be useful to you in your specific situation. And yet here it is, because the mechanism exists, because the threshold was crossed, because somewhere in the evolutionary history of our lineage, the conditions converged sufficiently that knowledge stopped dying with the people who generated it. The question of when this happened, precisely, is one that science continues to work on. The question of where, in exactly which population and in exactly which period, the convergence reached the critical point, is similarly open. The evidence gives us ranges and approximations, not dates and places. What the evidence does not leave open is the fact of the convergence itself. We are here. The ratchet is running. The knowledge is compounding. Whatever the threshold was, and whenever it was crossed, and the world on this side of it is different in kind from the world on the other side. Now ask the question that the evidence, ultimately, does not answer. If the process ran again, from the same starting conditions, would the threshold be crossed again? Would some lineage, on some branch of the tree of life, accumulate the same convergence of conditions and reach the same point? Or was this a singular event, the kind that the universe produces through processes that are individually comprehensible but collectively improbable, and does not guarantee to repeat? Science does not know, and there is something genuinely important in that not knowing, not as a rhetorical gesture, as a factual statement about the limits of what the evidence can tell us, and what those limits mean for how we understand what we are. If the crossing was improbable, if the convergence of conditions required was rare enough that it might not recur even given billions of years and countless lineages, then what we have inherited is not a default. It is not the predictable outcome of a process that tends toward this result. It is a specific outcome of a specific history that could have gone differently at many points and did not. The Neanderthals are part of that history. Their presence in it is not incidental. They are the evidence that the threshold was real, and that proximity to it was not sufficient to cross it. They are the mirror in which the crossing becomes visible. Without them, the threshold is just a concept. With them, it is a documented fact, a lineage that had much of what was needed, that was close enough that the question of what exactly was lacking has occupied researchers for generations, that went extinct, leaving a record that asks, quietly and without resolution, what the difference actually was. We do not know, not with the precision that would satisfy the question, not with the certainty that would allow the conversation to close. What we know is that the morning they inhabited and the morning you inhabit are separated by something real, Not just time, not just extinction, a difference in what each morning could become, in whether the knowledge generated by the people who lived it could travel forward, could survive, could compound into something no individual who contributed to it could have imagined. Their morning ended with them. Ours did not. Every morning you have lived has been built on the accumulated residue of every morning that preceded it, stretching back through the entire history of the lineage, all the way to the point where the conditions converged and the threshold was crossed and knowledge stopped dying with the people who generated it. That accumulation is invisible in the way that water is invisible to a fish. You move through it without noticing it because you have never experienced the alternative. The alternative is not available to you. You were born on this side of the threshold, and there is no way to unbirth yourself from it. No way to experience what it would be like to know only what you yourself could discover in a single lifetime. With no inheritance and no transmission and no ratchet running forward through time, you cannot feel the threshold from the inside. But you can look at what was on the other side of it. You can look at that morning, the fire, the worked stone, the child, the extraordinary creatures who tended it and fed it and kept it alive through a winter that asked everything. You can hold in your mind simultaneously how close they were to what we are, and how different the mornings they inhabited were from the morning you woke up to today. And in the space between those two things, in the gap between a morning that ended with the people who lived it and a morning that did not, you can feel, if you let yourself, something that does not have a clean name. Not triumph, not grief, not gratitude. Exactly. Though gratitude is closer than the others, something quieter than any of those. Something that comes from standing at the edge of a very large fact and allowing it to be as large as it actually is, without reaching for a word that would make it smaller and more manageable and less true. The threshold was real. It was crossed. And the fact that you are here, on this side of it, understanding these words, following this argument, feeling whatever you are feeling right now about the people who tended that fire 40,000 years ago, is the most complete demonstration available of what crossing it actually meant. Not an abstraction. This, right now, the sound of the threshold, still running forward.